It's really a pleasure to be chairing this evening two lectures that showcase Phanigiri, an extremely important Buddhist site in the state of Telangana. What is even more delightful is that the two lectures are going to be delivered by these leading historians of Indian art who also happen to be very good friends of mine. So wonderful to be here. The lectures are based on an outstanding volume that has been edited by Ahuja on Phanigiri. And those of you who may have had a chance to look at this volume would know that Phanigiri is actually quite easily accessible from Hyderabad. It's just 3 hours from there. Of course, when you look at the visuals in the volume and you look at the surroundings, you would think that you're really very far away from anything like, urban surroundings. The site itself occupies the top of a massive stone outcrop. And this is something that you see with a lot of Buddhist sites, in India and a lot of other sites in different parts of South Asia, including, for example, Sri Lanka and Sigiriya. And in the Indian context, I think of Sanchi, or I also think of the various minor edicts of Emperor Ashok in Karnataka, which are often in fairly inaccessible areas. So I think the idea of pilgrimage, going through some kind of physical discomfort to get to a place mattered. As the illustrations and the narrative richness of this volume shows, the devotional and the decorative art of Phanigiri is actually very dramatic and entirely stunning. The site is only half excavated. So the question is that why was this volume published? I think there were very good and urgent reasons for it to be published and the material to be documented. And this is because, as the preface to the volume tells us, Phanigiri is actually on the edge of very major changes. There is mining, there are new industries, there is the sprawling expansion of Hyderabad, and there are new highways. So, as I looked at the beautiful surroundings captured in the volume, I kept wondering what would happen, for example, to the water tank that is at the base of Phanigiri Hill, where there is also a megalithic burial. What Ahuja has pointed out in the book is that the villagers there have apparently carved out very sustainable livelihoods around it. But again, the question is whether this will survive the unstoppable pace of development there. So Phanigiri throws up questions relating to ancient India, but it also throws up very contemporary concerns about Indian heritage. And I'm sure our speakers are going to address both. So let me just introduce them. Parul Pandya Dhar will speak first. She'll speak on the jewel in the crown, lessons... A gateway to Phanigiri, reading architecture, constructing narrative at an early Buddhist site. She's a professor of art history at the Department of History in the University of Delhi. We were colleagues at that university, and she's always been, even after I left the university, my sounding board for anything that I see in the field, and I'm really deeply grateful for your knowledge and your generosity.
Thank you, Nayanjot.
She has written and authored many volumes, edited books. The volume which is very relevant for her lecture today is The Toran in Indian and Southeast Asian Art. But I would also strongly urge you to look at the multivalence of an epic retelling the Ramayana in South India and in Southeast Asia. She's currently working on art histories and epic encounters across the Indian Ocean. Naman Ahuja is professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University, and he specializes in Indian art history. He's an author of great repute, very prolific. He's written The Making of the Modern Indian Artist Craftsman, Devi Prasad, The Body in Indian Art and Thought, and The Art and Archaeology of Ancient India. These are some of the books that he's written. And also we've all enjoyed and learned from the many exhibitions that he has put together, both here and that is in Delhi at the National Museum and elsewhere. Naman Ahuja, after Parul, will speak on The Jewel in the Crown, Lessons on Heritage from Phanigiri. So with that, Parul, over to you.
Thank you.
Just go into presentation mode. It should be fine.
Okay. So let me begin by saying how happy I am to be here amidst all of you today. And I must first express my warmest gratitude to the India International Center, to Marg Publications, to my former colleague and friend, philosopher guide, Professor Nayanjot Lahiri, now in Ashoka University, but we spent many years together in the Department of History, and to Professor Naman Ahuja, the editor of today's book, my colleague, friend, and collaborator in understanding Phanigiri. How do we begin with a site as intriguing as Phanigiri? Naman and I were just talking a little while ago, and we decided that let's enter from the entrance. So, let me lead you into this site through the gateway. And as Nayanjot pointed out, I'm some kind of a gateway expert, having done a volume on the Torans. I was very excited when I found it. So let me say that I would like to take you further into the world of Phanigiri by entering the place through its magnificent gateway. Entering metaphorically, of course, for it has now fallen to pieces. Many of its fragments having been found in a cache by archaeologists during the excavation season of 2002. This is a photograph of the cache, courtesy the Department of Heritage, and this is the site, the Mahastupa, and somewhere here is where they discovered this cache where they had collected a whole lot of fragments and put them there. I first encountered Phanigiri as a site fallen to ruins a little over half a dozen years ago and was smitten by its exquisite fragments. For me, the intrigue surrounding Phanigiri unfolded as I tried to piece together the puzzle of its Toran gateway. Gradually, it felt as if the place in its ruins warmed up to my struggles for understanding it, and then yielded to me some part of its story. In virtually resurrecting the gateway to its former state, the available fragments offered much more than themselves. The missing links fell into place, and my attempts to arrive at its completeness were rewarded. The Phanigiri Toran happens to be the only substantial freestanding example of its kind to have survived in all of Deccan and South India. To bring the fragments to their plausible completeness, I worked at first with a hands-on approach, measuring tapes and the works during field trips, and later through graphic illustrations. The next phase was to engage with architectural design and in intimate association with iconography and narrative rationale. This method of reading architecture and constructing narrative from available fragments opened my eyes also to the methods of its makers, for constantly one had to try and understand how they may have structured the narrative on this magnificent gateway. So I kept thinking of the nameless ancient sculptors and architects who made Phanigiri. We have some names of Navakammikas and patrons, etc., but we do not have the names of artisans like we do in other sites. The cache of limestone sculptures from Phanigiri that archaeologists had uncovered in the year 2002 revealed close affinities with the celebrated Buddhist art of Amaravati and Nagarjunakonda, that is the period from the 1st to the 4th centuries AD in Andhra Pradesh. Among these were gently curving crossbars, so I'm talking of Phanigiri now, gently curving crossbars with composite animal terminals portraying the Buddha's biography and other narratives. This incidentally then fell in place as the topmost crossbar, half of it. There was at that time of its discovery, that is in 2002, much intrigue and interest as to the purpose of these architectural fragments. So unusual was this find in the Deccan that in the interim report on Phanigiri excavations, the two larger architraves have been mistakenly identified as balustrades. Such an omission on the part of trained archaeologists could perhaps be attributed to the fact that a structural toran of this kind had so far never been encountered in the archaeological landscape of early historic southern India. As no part of the toran was found in its original place, it is difficult to locate it precisely within the Phanigiri Buddhist complex. But it is still possible to infer its approximate location based on the site plan and find spot. The Grand Stoop is located very close to the southern edge of the site. This is the northern side, this here is the southern side, and this is the Mahastoop, which is very close to the southern side. And from here, where you have a refectory and some votive stupas, there's a very steep fall. Now, it's my reading, and a couple of us think that the southern pathway is too narrow to have held a grand torana of this kind, and it should be expected to have belonged to somewhere along the stairway in between the chaityas, the octagonal structure, and the stairs leading up to the Mahastoop. So I would locate it near its find spot in one of these places that I've marked in red. Now, during my most detailed site visits in January 2017 and June 2018, I first had access to 3 sizable Toran architrave fragments housed in the store maintained by the Department of Heritage Telangana at Phanigiri. Besides these, I was also able to locate 4 smaller fragments in the architectural debris that had been kept in the storehouse. So these had been found, but besides these, there were a couple more that I will soon come to. The 3 larger parts of the gateway are exquisitely carved on the front and rear sides. So this is the front and this is the back of the same fragment that has been found, each with a distinct addorsed composite animal figure with riders at the terminals, and you see a lion makara here. Mm, you see a griffin with a beak. Maybe I should go back a little. This one, a griffin makara and an elephant makara. There are three completely different animal forms at its extremities. You also notice mortise holes, these kind of holes. All of this led me back to all my work on Toranas, and I began to recognize that these connected with each other in particular ways to conjure something that comes very close to the Sanchi Toran, all the way up north central India. And I was completely fascinated how this is appearing on the hilltop in the Deccan. Now, a unique feature of all of these is the ordered progression of Buddha's biographical narratives on the front faces of the crossbar. This too is not known from anywhere. Nagarjunakonda gives some ordered narratives, but that is on the Ayaka bars, not anywhere else. A composite lion makara terminal is followed by this cuboid die that you see. I'm looking at the left image, and on it is carved the scene where we see Maya, Siddhartha's mother, who holds the branch of a shala tree as her infant is born and is received on a swaddle cloth by 4 devas or deities. Celebrations around the birth are portrayed in a corner here. Celebrations begin with the announcement of Siddhartha's birth, and the composition and its representation bears affinities to Ikshvaku period art of Amaravati and Nagarjunakonda. The surviving terminal of one of the other architraves, the larger surviving architrave, has a griffin makara at its end, identifiable very differently from the lion. Its front is carved in a continuous progression of the Buddha's life narratives. The first scene that we see is on this cuboid die, and this shows the Shakyavardhana, who is the tutelary deity of the Shakya clan, into which Prince Siddhartha was born. Now he's portrayed here emerging from his tree shrine. In recognition of the newborn's true nature, the deity offers obeisance to the Bodhisattva, who is represented symbolically by his footprints. Here on the swaddle cloth, this is the symbolic representation of Siddhartha. Detailed attention is lavished on the architecture of the tree shrine at Phanigiri, and it calls for a separate essay in itself, the kind of detailing of the tree shrine here, which I will resist for, the evening has so many wonderful surprises waiting for you that I will resist a detailed description of the tree shrine. It follows then, on the lower architrave we saw Siddhartha being born. Here you have him being seen, being taken to the tutelary deity Shakyavardhana, who instead of blessing him, salutes him because he comes to know that, that he is the Bodhisattva himself. The next scene that we see is that of young Prince Siddhartha as he sets out of his palace in a chariot and witnesses the 3 harsh realities of the human condition in the form of a sick man, an aging man, and a dead man. So here you have an aging man, a sick man, and a dead man being mourned by his relatives. Now, this is something that Siddhartha hadn't seen before. This is his charioteer, Chandaka, and, this makes him extremely pensive. He returns to the palace in a very different frame of mind from what he had started, and is known to have, during spring festival, meditated in the palace. This is his first meditation, where he meditated under the jambu tree, the rose apple tree, and began to think of the purpose of life. His father, Shuddhodana, tried every means possible to dissuade him from becoming thoughtful and despondent, for he knew what would follow next, which is the next scene. I mean, it's a beautifully crafted, continuous narration of the birth scenes. And here he sits thoughtfully in the midst of all the revelry in his palace, near his wife, and he considers and goes ahead with abandoning the palace. And interestingly, Torana within a Torana, here you have a tiny Torana as the entry and the exit into his chamber. And this then also is always used to show scenes of the great departure, in early Buddhist art. The Toran is central to exiting the city of Kapilavastu, the palace of Kapilavastu. And this Toran is a great indicator of the next scene to follow, which incidentally I found in a separate piece thrown away, Naman would know, on the first floor of the storehouse, where, the home where it has been kept, split into two. And yes, that was the great departure scene. Here it is, this part. You see the hoofs of the horse. And here is what Peter Skilling has identified as Mara appearing in some recensions of the narrative as trying to block Siddhartha's departure, because he knows this departure would lead to his next, he would lead him to attain nirvana. Lead him to attain bodhi and then nirvana. Now, after this, we don't have the sequence on this architrave. There's a gap. And this, what you see below, is the rear side of the Toran. So the last architrave has an elephant Makara Toran, and from the right to the left, you have certain parts missing, as you see, almost half missing, a little less than half, but you have enough evidence here to tell you that this is the scene of Buddha's victory over Mara. He attains victory over Mara, and he calls the earth goddess as witness, defeats all forms of lust, greed, that are represented by Mara, and achieves bodhi. Now here he is Buddha, and he is being brought the 4 bowls by the 4 kings, which he then turns into 1 bowl for his, for begging alms. And his first meal is served by the merchant community, merchants Tapusha and Bahlika, who feed him his first meal, which also is something that connects with the great nexus between Buddhism and the trading community. Then the final scene is a very beautiful, Dharma Chakra Pravartana, the setting of the wheel of the Buddhist law in motion at Sarnath, Mrigadava, the deer park, and perhaps some of the most beautiful carvings here in the form of the ascetics who were first following the extreme path and then became the followers of the Buddha. Well, so this is the narrative from the birth scenes to the to the attainment of enlightenment. What is interesting is that it stops here. It does not go up to the parinirvana, and in that sense it is incomplete. Now this incompleteness is also a clue, because Vaso Tournier and others have shown us that some of the Buddhist textual traditions, the oldest among which have survived only in Chinese, could yield important clues to understand the development of the hagiographical tradition in South Asia, as they too end at the Enlightenment. They don't go beyond Enlightenment. So after detailed measurements and a close interpretation of narrative configuration, my reconstruction of the Phanigiri Torana revealed that it had 3 architraves similar to the famous Sanchi Toranas. At Phanigiri, each architrave had a different composite animal. When architectural design, proportion, and progression of narrative are correlated, it becomes evident that the Buddha's life events on the front faces of the architraves began with birth-related episodes and followed a continuous sequence to culminate in the Buddha's first sermon. By comparing portrayals of the Buddha's biography at other early Buddhist sites in Andhra, especially at Nagarjunakonda and the final phase at Amaravati, it is possible to reasonably imagine the lost visual narrative. So to basically to look for completeness in the fragment. The Buddha's biography at Phanigiri has opened on the bottom architrave, of which this birth is the last scene. So we have the pre-birth scenes before that are very common in Nagarjunakonda and Amaravati, and these would have included the Bodhisattva in Tushita heaven, the descent of the white elephant, Maya's dream and the interpretation of the dream, and culminated in the birth of Siddhartha on the surviving die of the lowest architrave. The narrative then continues on the middle architrave with the salutation to the newborn Bodhisattva by Shakyavardhana, Siddhartha's 3 encounters with old age, disease, and death, his meditation under a jambu tree, and his final night in the palace, followed by the great departure, as is observed in the progression of Buddha's life in the Andhra idiom. The available fragment of the top architrave visualizes Mara Vijaya. We don't have the missing portions on this side, the events between departure and Mara Vijaya and leading up to the enlightenment that I have just discussed. So going by Nagarjunakonda especially and also Amaravati, Akira Shimada has worked out in detail the repertoire that comes in between these two scenes in the Andhra idiom, and this includes Siddhartha's charioteer Chandaka conveying the news of his departure to his father Shuddhodana, Prince Siddhartha giving up his princely robes, jewels, and turban, shearing of Siddhartha's hair, transportation of the turban, and Sujata offering payasa to Siddhartha before his meditation under the Bodhi tree, which would then connect with the Mara Vijaya scene. And this is how it is laid out, and you know, it sort of the space and the curvature, etc., having been tallied, works out very well in terms of the scenes that I am discussing, both the absent and the present. Intriguing visual narratives with no known parallels in the early Buddhist art of Andhra occupy the rear side of the architraves. These are the pieces that have been found. These appear to have a great affinity to local contexts at Phanigiri. For you, unlike the front face, you find nothing of it in Amaravati or Nagarjunakonda. A careful reading of their visual detail yields some important insights. The portrayals on the rear side of the Torana are filled with events after the parinirvana. They foreground the role of royalty and the Buddhist Sangha in negotiating a dominant space for Buddhism through their interactions with the prevalent popular beliefs, such as the worship of the Nagas. You see a prolific representation of Nagas, confrontation between the monks and the Nagas, relics, congregation of monks, and the presence of stupa chaityas, which highlights that such practices of worship of the Buddha and his relics and the building of stupas and chaityas and the creation of different nikayas and sects were in progress post-parinirvana. Reconstructed from ruins, the gateway to Phanigiri is unique not only in being the rare survivor in the early architectural history of South India, it is also an aesthetically significant monument that symbolizes the intended function of a toran as a marker of liminal space. On its front, viewers would have encountered a continuous narration of the Buddha's journey from his birth to enlightenment. Filled with this imagery of the Buddha's earthly life, they would have crossed over to its other side, where events that occurred after the Buddha's final emancipation from earthly life and the legacy of his teachings are portrayed. This magnificent gateway had in the past marked both a physical and a metaphorical transformative experience for all those who visited the site. The grandeur of the reconstructed gateway demonstrates to us in modernity the creativity and innovativeness of its ancient artists in bringing together art vocabularies that had close affinities with neighboring sites in Andhra and Telangana on the one hand, but also with far-flung Buddhist networks along the Uttarapatha and Dakshinapatha that connected northern and southern Indian idioms of early Buddhist art. Approaching this puzzle of fragments at Phanigiri has helped me to unravel not just the unique architectural significance of the Phanigiri Torana, but has also helped me to understand the creative processes of its makers in imagining its thoughtful configuration. And now that I have led you into the Toran, it is Naman's great responsibility and also his pleasure as the editor to take you into what is there on the site. Welcome.
There's a seat here if anyone needs it. It's spare. Thank you all very much. It's rather overwhelming to see so many of you here today. Some years back, in fact, it was in 2001, I had the great privilege to be able to visit Phanigiri for the first time and go into its little storeroom. I had recently joined the British Museum as a curator, and I had met up with a colleague called Akira Shimada. We were both working in the same department and under Robert Knox, who had written a book on Amravati. And we traveled through the sites of Andhra, as it was then, together to Guntur and Ghantashala and to Amravati and to Nagarjunakonda and so on and so forth. And then some years later, I went back, I think about 10 years later, to see the sites again, and then again. And somehow going to that storeroom at the foot of Phanigiri Hill had become it just kept sort of coming back time and again in my life. And then some years back, the government of Telangana by that time invited me to a seminar where I met up with Parul and found other colleagues who had also been similarly intrigued by this site and had been working on different aspects of it. And the government of Telangana very kindly collaborated with MargxIIC, of which I had become the editor, and we decided that a book on this extraordinary site was much needed. In about 2011, I first put in a request to borrow one particular statue from Phanigiri for the body in Indian art, which was to be shown in Brussels in 2013 and then in the National Museum in 2014. The request was denied. Telangana had not yet come into its own as a state, and they didn't have the necessary wherewithal to be able to lend me the sculpture. But the other main reason was that the Archaeological Survey of India used to embed sculptures in concrete. And that meant that yanking it out of the concrete where the sculpture had now been placed would have run the risk of breaking the original limestone, rendering it so much damage on the piece that it wouldn't have been exhibition worthy, and there was no conservator who was willing to run the risk of chipping away the concrete carefully to be able to make that masterpiece available for the body in Indian art. So a few years later, when the opportunity came for India and the world, Providence would have it that I finally managed, and we managed to send in our request and arrange for the specialized conservation services to be able to fix that sculpture, cut it out from the concrete, have it restored and repaired, and put it on display at the CSMVS as the great jewel in the crown of India. And a story began to develop. In my talk today, for my talk today, and the stories behind the coming of this, bringing this book together, there are so many people to thank that I won't be able to do it properly. Peter Skilling has been a great mentor who has really been extremely generous with his knowledge of ancient Buddhist literature and texts, and it was a great pleasure to be able to discuss one's ideas with him over the past few years to be able to form this book, to put this book together. I think John Guy and Akira lent something extraordinary in terms of being able to look at the narratives and look at comparable sculptures from other sites in Andhra and Telangana. But I think what Visalachi has pulled off in this particular book, in terms of the study of the archaeology of this site, is truly something quite dense and remarkable, that she's really been able to produce a piece of writing that understands the orientation of this site in the way that she's been able to give it to us. It's a pretty complicated site. It's perched high on a granite hill. Oh, that's just the cover of the book. Phanigiri, by the way, for those of you who don't know, it's only one of many, many sites in the region of Andhra and Telangana which have similar sculpture from that period, and some even in northern Karnataka at Sannati. But there are, that's just a map of sites that are comparable in the region. And you can see that. Now, this is an aerial view of Phanigiri, and that's why it's called Phanigiri, because it looks like a snake. And because it looks like the head of a serpent, like a pan, therefore, the colloquial name has been given to it of Phanigiri. However, as I've put forward in my chapter, there are other possible etymological origins for this word. And I don't think this word is actually an ancient word. We don't know what this site might have been called originally. Now, looking at it aerially on this Google map drawing, it's in this S shape. And like every good ancient Nag, the mani, the jewel, is often contained within the serpent. And so in the middle of the serpent over here, that's the land which is the Buddhist monastic space. And in the crook of the serpents over here, there are these aquifers, these two large megalithic period water reservoirs which go from here and extend into this area where you can see it's rather wet because of how green it is all along the side, because the water can collect over here, and so this is used for agriculture. And so the runoff from this hill is collected in two ponds. And those ponds have now been overlaid with temples. One of them has become a temple, and the other one, in the dry season, you can still see the ancient megalithic burial cairns in the heart of it. So there's an older history. Even before Buddhism, this site had a prehistory, as it were. These are that's the landscape. Now, you know this part of Telangana is very arid. It grows millet, it grows chilies, it doesn't have wetland. This is a very deceptive photograph. The real photograph is actually, I mean, looking at these euphorbia cactoids that are growing in the rock. I think this is more indicative of the kind of aridity of the site. Looking at it closely, you'll see that the site, as we were just understanding, has a Mahastupa. And then within the complex, there are two small apsidal temples, chaityas. Then there was an octagonal stupa, kind of a votive stupa in this courtyard space. Then there's supposed to be one zone over here where there was a building, a structure of some kind, maybe a monastery or a temple, and then a larger one over here, another big monastic space, another hall, which overlooked two larger temples, two larger Chaitya apsidal temples at the rear end. Today, as Parul was just explaining, we all access the site from this side where the slope is a lot gentler, so you can easily climb up. But in ancient times, we wonder whether the site might have been better accessed through the precipitous rise on this side of the mountain, where there's a rather sharp cliff, a set of narrow steps, there are post holes all the way through. It might have been shaded, it might have had a canopy on it. Those post holes are now filled with plants which are growing out of it, and it's quite easy to see how a pilgrim may have come either from that side or indeed accessed it from the other side, as Parul indicated. Now, we're not absolutely certain. My personal feeling is that they came up the tough way, which is up the cliff, because that is what pilgrims are wont to do. But that's another matter. The site has over 150, around its perimeter, 150 cells. These all along on the border. Small cells that are facing outward. So that was rather curious. They're not facing into the stupa, but they're facing outward, and they're all along the entire perimeter of this site, 150 of them. There are lots of bits of limestone broken sculptures, including Buddha Padas, the Torana, and some of the statues, the main statue that I want to talk about, which was the one that came to the CSMVS. But I'll come to that in a second. About 10 years ago, in the excavations that took place, they began to find deposited all together broken bits of statues. And so here you can see a portion of the Toran gateway that Parul has reconstructed for us just now. A large statue, life-size, of a massive yaksha or a bodhisattva. There are the other remains of another architrave of that Toran. And then there were other big, important monumental sculptures, all found together in this zone, in front of one of the small apsidal temples. You can see these are the two small apsidal temples. And there would have been a balustrade and steps along here, coming up to this area where you could come to these two temples on top. So it wasn't a site at one level. Even on top of this granite hill, it was a multi-leveled site with steps and balustrades within it. The site has revealed some rather telling inscriptions. And these inscriptions, out of them, there are two inscriptions in particular which are noteworthy. One is a bilingual inscription of a king by the name of Rudra Purushadatta, which is on an octagonal pillar, and the lines of this inscription record the donations that were made at that time. Rudra Purushadatta is a king of the Ikshvakus, and while most of the inscription is in Sanskrit, the last few lines are suddenly in Prakrit. Was this bilingualism to appeal to different types of visitors? sites around Guntur have images from the 4th century that are both Hindu as well as Buddhist. Now, this inscription says something rather remarkable. It says, in the 18th year, it gives a date, in the 18th year of Rudrapurusha Datta, in the 3rd fortnight of winter, on the 3rd day of the month, the chief physician of Sri Rudrapurusha Datta carried out this erection of a dharma chakra, carried out this erection of a dharma wheel. So this pillar was supposed to have a big chakra on top of it once upon a time. Second line says, the banner of pride of the one who rides a makar. The banner of pride of the one who rides a makar. Now, who rides a makar? Which male god is associated with? Kamadev, right? So he says, Kama, who was not felled by the one who rides with the banner of a bull. Who rides with the banner of the bull? Shiv. So Kam, who could not be killed by Shiv, Kam, who could not be killed by Shiv, has been felled by the descendant of the Shakya family because of this wheel of dharma. Okay? So that's a rather interesting second line. The third line, the demon of hatred who was not killed by the mighty killer of Kans. Hatred who was not killed by the killer of Kans, i.e. Krishna, or the killer of Madhu, or Madhu and Kaitha, the killer of Madhu, Vishnu, that one was killed by the killer of passions because of this excellent dharma chakra. So what Krishna could not kill, what Shiv could not kill, what Vishnu has not been able to remove, those qualities of passions, of deceit, of vulgarity, that dharma chakra has managed to quell. And then it carries on, the great forests of defilements have been burnt by him with the flaming knowledge that has the qualities of the highest dhyana, as fuel and its origin in the fire stick that is the body of Maya. The fire stick, which is the body of Maya, by means of this very wheel of Dharma Chakra, may the world with gods, demons, and men know that this wheel endowed with such good qualities is a donation by Nadarnika in the pleasure grove of the great general, erected for the sake of bringing about his own nirvana and effected by the venerable Dhammasena. There is a man by the name of Dhammasena, the monk, in whose honor, in whose presence this is being erected. Fine. Who is his teacher? So he acknowledges his teacher. There is another inscription at Phanigiri which tells us a lot about the festivals at that time. And it tells us about the renovations within the site. It says, the monk Dhammasena erected a flower canopy over the chhatri of the stupa. So the stupa had the chhatri on it, and over the chhatri he erected an entire banner, an entire canopy of flowers that he covered the whole building with. He also made a donation of 150 cows to perpetually feed the monks who live in this monastery. So that's the donation that he gave. He also gave a donation of gold coins, enough gold coins to pay for the oil that will be needed to keep the flame of the diya at the site burning in perpetuity. So he gave enough gold for the site. Now, these inscriptions at the site may be few, but they're rather revealing. They're telling us something extraordinary about the nature of Buddhism in India in the 4th century, 3rd to 4th century, about what Buddhists did, how they prayed, and how there might have been a tacit nature of competitiveness between an understanding of what Brahmanism can lead to and what Buddhism can lead to. And these things are being recorded in these inscriptions over there. This tells us something remarkable about the shifting nature of Buddhism at the site, which is what Peter Skilling's rather eloquently written chapter in the book deals with. I can't presume to summarize that for you, but what I can do as an art historian is at least touch upon the rather remarkable fragments of sculptures that are found at the site, which show a distinctly Amaravati Nagarjunakonda southern style of Buddha statues, anthropomorphic images of the Buddha, which are dated to about the 3rd, maybe as late as the 4th, but probably the 3rd century, late 3rd century AD, which we have found a few examples of at Phanigiri. Some are shattered in smithereens. Some have been patiently reconstructed. This one we found headless, but then at another occasion I held up, as you can see in the storeroom, I found these 2 separate pieces of one of the heads of the Buddhas, which I managed to piece together for the sake of a photograph. And one day, indeed, there will be people and enough conservators and restorers who will go back to this site, and I hope will be motivated by this book to be able to take on the challenge of creating a heritage and a site museum at Phanigiri and start the conservation work which is urgently needed. There are inscriptions at the site which are lying shattered, which also need to be put back together, not just the statues that we've been looking at. There are other unique things in the nature of Buddhism in the Deccan. There are lots of statues of Ganas and Yakshas, and in amongst them also Mithun sculptures. And one of the extraordinary things at Phanigiri is that the Yashti, the pillar that would have been on top of the stupa, right on top the yupa, which would have come between the harmika, right on top of the pillar of the stupa, that actually is carved with Mithun scenes, which is a very unusual location for erotic sculpture, you would imagine. But it is not the only one of its kind. There are others in the Deccan that also have shown this particular iconographic formulation, where the corners, the strategic corners, you can see have been given a Mithun sculpture. And here too, this is an octagonal piece. So it is not in east, west, north, and south, but it is in the northeast, southwest, etc., in the diagonals that you would find the Mithun couples that have been positioned over here. We're increasingly being able to make a connection in the history of how these sites developed and how they might have inspired early Brahmanical temples. And this comes from a very interesting period of an overlap between late Buddhist sites and early Brahmanical temples. Firstly, being sited on top of a hilltop, having these steps going up to it, to be able to create an environment in which you have a refectory, monastic cells, an entire complex with multiple shrines. So you've got something which is reminiscent of another site in South Asia at the same time, with which I would like to make a parallel, which is the site of Takhte Bahi in Gandhara. And I think the 2 Buddhist sites are roughly contemporaneous, and there are more than one similarity in these 2 spaces. Dharma chakras, yashtis, and yakshas, with special reference to Phanigiri, as I was just mentioning, is a specialized chapter in the book by John Guy. What is one of the special things in that chapter is the attention he has paid to this remarkable life-size statue of a male figure. Is it a yaksha or is it a bodhisattva? We don't know. My personal reading was I was more inclined to think of it as a bodhisattva, but he was more inclined to think of it as a yaksha. And it could be either. The statue is rather remarkable when you look at its details, in the way it has been sculpted, very fine bits of the tassel, the way the fingers have been modeled. This is how it was discovered. Now, this is not the only sculpture which has been discovered of such monumentality. Perhaps I am a little too used to that sculpture, so I am not marveling at it and exhorting and going on about how remarkable it is, because for me, what really struck me was this one. This is a clay sculpture. I'm more partial perhaps to stucco and clay, and maybe that's why. Now, he's not as refined as the beautiful stone sculpture, but he tells us something which is a lot more. This really does look like a pot-bellied yaksha. And this is life-size too. And finding stucco images, which means that it's terra cruda, it's not fired clay. It's not terracotta, right? It's not fired. So it's just a clay image. And when you are looking at all those cells that were around the perimeter, at Takhte Bahi in Gandhara, which is in Yusufzai, you had massive statues of bodhisattvas that would be inside the cells. And rather than thinking of these cells as spaces where monks could live, I wonder whether, rather like Gandhara, they might have alternated with statues of some kind. And if these statues were clay and stucco, then that would explain a lot. It seems that many sites in the Deccan had clay sculptures, had stucco sculptures. But we've only studied stucco as if it was the prerogative of Takshila and Gandhara and in art history. And we've never actually thought that the rest of India and South Asia could have also used stucco images. And these are some of the other stuccos that have been found at Phanigiri, ornaments, heads, figures, including, oops, what happened there? I should turn, including these rather remarkable heads of Padmanidhi and Shankhanidhi, exactly like the two heads from Nagarjunakonda, which many art historians will be familiar with, these two beautiful Gana Yakshas who are in the Nagarjunakonda Museum that show the Padmanidhi and Shankhanidhi. Well, you found exactly the same thing at Phanigiri, but you only found their heads over there for the two Yakshas. So stucco sculptures were all over Phanigiri as well. And when I was doing the research for this book, I was very pleasantly surprised that scholars in Shantiniketan who had visited Amaravati more than 40, 50 years ago had left behind a small tract on having found stucco images in Amaravati as well. And again, we've never really talked about the importance of this clay sculpture of the region. So Visalachi, as I said, does a very detailed study of the orientation of the site and the different buildings in the site and how they could have been used. She highlights how the halls are unusual, that the central four pillars seem to be in the middle of the hall, are given prominence, which lead to reasonable assumptions that the center of the shrine was perhaps roofed differently. So Sandhara temples, we know, have shrines in the middle of a temple where there are four pillars with a garbhagriha, which is in the center of the shrine, accessed from all sides. And was something like that being constructed in Phanigiri? Because in the halls, over here, it's not just the pillars and the perimeter that are important, but the four pillars in the center of the hall seem to be of a larger, more monumental scale, perhaps indicating that there was a central shrine. So there's been a lot of reconstruction and sleuthing of looking at the site carefully to be able to work out what this site could have really looked like. And when thinking about the overall impact it would have had, you have to think about it from the ground of Phanigiri, where you would have looked up and seen this remarkable site on top of this granite hill. And it would have really commanded the view not just of Phanigiri, but looking at a number of other small hills in the far distance, which also had stupas on them, or around them rather. So there is a certain significance to the location and elevation that we need to think about. Akira Shimada does a careful analysis of looking at the sculpting at this site and comparing it with sculptures from other sites in the same region to be able to come up with a reasonable chronology for the objects at Phanigiri. Parul has already talked about her marvelous chapter on taking us into Phanigiri through her Toran gateway. And I think I'm not going to talk about that, but I think the most extraordinary aspect of this Toran is the richness with which we now understand how pilgrims would have accessed the Mahastupa and come back out, and what stories they might have seen on either side, and how the stories are distinct in the two readings that you would have had in the experience of pilgrims at this site. Now, I wish to talk about this sculpture, which is called the Jewel in the Crown, as I call it, Lessons on Heritage from Phanigiri. This was a sculpture that now lies in the State Museum of Hyderabad. And it's a rather peculiar sculpture because the top portion of the stele is carved into a turban. The scene, the narrative of this sculpture is quite straightforward. It's the story of the Mahabhinishkramana, the great departure, and the sacrifice of his turban. I'll go into the details of the story with you in a second. For now, please observe how absolutely remarkable and precise the carving is. And each figure has been thought of as beautifully and composed in the way that it has been. The sculpture is broken into 3 panels. The lowest panel shows Siddhartha leaving his palace, going off on his journey to discover his path. The middle panel is where he has cast off his royal robes, his royal clothes, and he has thrown away his royal turban. That royal turban, the symbol of his inheritance, the symbol of his family, his lineage, his crown, never fell on the ground. The Lalita Vistar and the other stories and other legends tell us that instead of falling on the ground, the gods intervened and Siddhartha's turban flew up like a swan into the sky. It unraveled and it went flying up and up till it reached the 33rd heaven, Trayatrimsha. And there it was received by the celestials, and the gods who received it made a chaitya in Tushita to pray for others to pray, and for Maya to be able to pray, because Maya, the Buddha's mother, had died a week after he was born. And so Maya and others could pray at the site, at this chaitya in heaven, where Siddhartha's symbol of his family and his turban ended up eventually. So we have the upper portion of the entire carving is made into a turban. The whole thing is a turban. Now, like every prince, every self-respecting turban must have a jewel in the turban. There'll be a kalgi in the turban. There'll be something in the turban. So the jewel in the turban of Siddhartha is this central portion, this circular portion that you see, which would be the jewel in the turban. But here the jewel is made up not of a shining stone, but of a scene, of a narrative. There's a story. So the jewel is a story. What is the story? And I'll come to that in a minute. So just for you to see the carving and observe it, that this is Siddhartha leaving the palace on his beloved horse Kanthak, and Chandak is showing the way, and there is a person in front holding up a lamp. Here's the person who's holding a candle like a lamp to shine the way. That's Siddhartha in the center when he's cast away his clothes. Kanthak is beside him, and all his other courtiers are gradually saying goodbye to him one by one. We now know that ancient Buddhists didn't just read sacred texts. There were very important dramas, plays, like the Buddha Charita, which were enacted at many of these Buddhist sites. And that would have been the popular version of Buddhism through the plays that people would have learnt about their stories of Buddhism. That's how the public would mostly have come to know about the narratives of Buddhism. In Patrick Olivell's translation of the Buddha Charita, he gives us a very interesting, it's worth reading some of the passages because they're rather revealing in Canto 6 of the play. Chandak is sent back, and Chandak is being sent back to the palace, and it's the scene in which it provides the artistic reenactment which takes us right to the heart of the aesthetic milieu of the story. So thanking Chandak, the Bodhisattva Siddhartha says, we all support our sons only for the sake of our families. One serves our fathers only for the sake of getting some sustenance. In all these families, the world shows affection only for a motive. He's rather cynical. Kinship, family ties, only endure because of a material cause. Right? He carries on. He takes out the gem from his headdress, a gem that has performed the task of a lamp until now. And as he stands there on stage, he makes his oration like Mount Mandar holding up the sun. He says, with this gem, Chanda, you must pay repeated homage to the king and beseech him without being diffident to relieve his anguish and use these words, please say to my father, this was the firm resolution, as you know, of our ancestors. Do not grieve for me as I walk on this path, my patrimony. I cast my patrimony aside. For when a man passes away, there are heirs to his wealth. But heirs to dharma on this earth are absent or hard to find. So when he heard these words of his, Chanda, who was overcome by grief, folded his hands and replied in a voice that was choking with tears. And Chanda exhorted the Bodhisattva to please reconsider his decision. So a few verses later, the Buddha replies, or Siddhartha rather, replies, if you have made up your mind to abandon your father, Chanda replies, if you have made up your mind to abandon your father and kingdom, at least don't abandon me, my lord, he says. For your feet are my sole refuge. Siddhartha explains to him in turn that even those who love each other are forced to separate by death, just as he had to be separated from his own mother, from Maya. After hearing these words, Kanthak, the beloved horse of Siddhartha, started crying. And Kanthak licked with his tongue Siddhartha's feet. Thereafter, the Bodhisattva, Siddhartha, cut off his turban and his hair with a sword, which he took from Chandak's hand, and threw it away. Now, it seemed as if he was throwing a swan into the lake. As it was thrown up, heavenly beings caught it out of reverence so that they may worship that turban. Throngs of gods in heaven paid it homage with divine honors according to rule. Besides, so what I'm trying to come at is you can see the theatricality of the whole thing. You can read a play from that time and you can imagine this happening on stage as a ballet. It's absolutely constructed line by line for dancers and actors to be able to enact this entire thing. And if this was being enacted at the time all the way from Central Asia to Telangana, where this play we know was extremely popular, then we can try and understand how the performative culture might have impacted the visual culture that we are looking at in this particular scene. So Phanigiri is not the only place where we have this moment. Now, what is it that is actually in the jewel, in the crown over here? We see five celestial beings holding up a large salver or a tray, in the middle of which there is another turban, right? So it's a whole scene of a turban, and inside the turban there is another turban being lifted up. But this turban which is being lifted up is the sacrificed turban of Siddhartha. And the jewel in the crown is therefore the sacrifice of Siddhartha is being noted as the true jewel. The real jewel is not a flashy piece of stone, but it is the act of sacrifice which we are being told is the real jewel of Siddhartha. He who is able to throw away his material inheritance and patrimony and to be able to give it up for the sake of dharma, that is the true jewel in the turban of Siddhartha. So we're getting the lesson loud and clear about leaving materialism behind. And the jewel in the crown of Buddhism is not to hang on to materiality, because even kinship, as the play says, is bound by materiality. So that's the reverse of the sculpture where you can see the carvings. Um, Phanigiri is not the only place in India which has this celebration of this scene. Bharut has a depiction of the turban being prayed to. Sanchi has a similar shrine which shows the turban being prayed to by celestials. It's there at Kanganahalli, where you see the turban being carried up by celestials into heaven. It's there again in Kanganahalli, where there is an entire temple, and at the top of the temple, in the highest Gavaksha, there is the turban. So there's a temple to the turban, which we are shown. So this is obviously an important thing at many Buddhist sites at this time, between the 2nd century BC all the way to the 3rd century AD. Many sites have this depiction. The side of our stele has these depictions of the Dharma Chakra, and I wonder what such steles could actually mean and how this object was used. I'm reminded of hero stones and memorials, because memorial stones or ayaka pillars at Buddhist stupas sometimes have relic pots below them. And we have these 5 ayaka pillars which have been shown at some stupas in the Deccan, which have a turban top. The uppermost Ushnisha on some of these ayakas is actually in the shape of a turban, and that tells us that the idea of these pillars being regarded as being a person, like a substitute for a human being on whom you would put a turban, and under the pillar you would put the ashes of that person. So these pillars were actually working as substitutes for people. And I think that is what we are looking at with some of these large pillars in Amravati as well. And that's how they must have been used. So now, to end my talk, the second half of my paper, in my chapter in the book, is really about the politics of heritage. As I was explaining in the beginning, I tried to borrow this sculpture in 2012, 2013, and I was denied, and then I was granted permission to be able to show it in India in 2017. There's a certain politics to the story behind how it happened. In 2017, I was co-curating an exhibition called India in the World, A History in 9 Stories, in which chosen pieces from the British Museum were to be paired in a dialogue with objects from India. The British Museum, as you know, is under a lot of attack in the media all over the world for housing stolen objects which are because of colonial loot, have come to it because of colonial loot. And there is a lot that is being said in the press on what is the purpose of having all of these Indian artifacts lying in Bloomsbury. So at a press conference in the UK, a journalist from The Guardian asked me, will you be talking about colonization and will you be taking Indian objects to India? And I had to reply to that with the truth, which was that no, the British Museum is lending 100 objects from the rest of the world, the kind of things that Indians never have the opportunity to see, but the British Museum has, to India, which I will be positioning in a dialogue along with objects from India that will be put into a dialogue with those objects, because we have enough Indian art within India. And so I was asked, well, what about the jewel in the crown of the British Museum, i.e. Amaravati? Are you not taking Amravati statues to India? And I said, no, we have enough things in India which are as beautiful as Amravati, which we haven't yet seen, which we really need to see. And they said, what? And I said, Phanigiri. And having made a public declaration about this fact, I think the Phanigiri statue now really had to be restored and had to be put on view. And so the jewel in the crown arrived for public view in Bombay. And we spent a lot of time on having it restored and putting it on view. Now, sorry, that's just the British Museum and a protest that was going on outside it. So when the statue was originally found, it was found in this condition. And that's a bit of Parul's Toran at the back, right? You can see when it was still in the mud, before it had been excavated. So this was the broken piece on Phanigiri Hill. And then it was rapidly and patiently restored, and that's the hand of a friend of mine, Anupam Shah, who works at the CSMVS, and his team of restorers, who put the sculpture back together again for it to look spectacular and on view at the exhibition. Now, in the exhibition, we positioned it rather strategically. It was a gallery on empire, and whereas the rest of the gallery was about how kings of the world want to hold on to power, here comes the great moral lesson from India, which says, give up power. The true king is the one who gives up power. So we were forming a great Indian moral high ground and counterpoint in the middle of all of this gallery by saying, we forsake our patrimony for the greater good of dharma, right? And so we made a rather dramatic gesture in that gallery, but the truth is more poignant, because the truth is that the heritage site of Phanigiri, we can't be complacent about it. It's lying shattered. Bits of torrents and their curving tails, the head of the end of a griffin from one of the torrents found there, waiting to be put back together and pieced back together. Her mind is already ticking on where she could place it. And, there are these broken fragments everywhere. And one needs to think that, this is a view of the Madras Museum, the Chennai Museum's gallery of Amravati sculptures until a few years ago. We had to petition the government, and we had to write articles in the press as a community, really shaming the government into doing something, because these walls would get sodden with water for 4 months of the year, damaging the limestone sculptures to such a degree that they were so fragile that only now the Chennai Museum has a new gallery for their protection. So at least it's been fixed now, and Chennai does have a new gallery for them. And if we can do it eventually, belatedly, but eventually in Chennai, surely we can do these things for Amravati as well. So I end my talk with just a detail of that beautiful fragment. When Siddharth threw away his patrimony, not everyone celebrated it. There's one person there who salutes him for it, and there's another person there who's so horrified at what Siddharth is doing in giving up his inheritance and giving up his entire patrimony that he is hiding his face. And that's rather like us, isn't it? We don't know what to do with our riches. Do we really want the responsibility of having them all back? Or do we all say, well, thank you very much, but we are relieved of the responsibility of so much materialism? I'll leave you with that thought. You can make your own minds up. Thank you.
Thank you both for absolutely fabulous presentations. And we have time, I think, for a few questions. So I'm throwing this open to the audience. Who would like to begin?
No.
Okay, so maybe I should start. There's a question for you, Parul, and another one for you, Naman. So, one is, of course, how your idea of torrents. I'm curious to know, you've done that monumental work on gateways, and how has this gateway changed your perception of gateways in general? I'm also curious to understand how you look at the expressions on the faces of many of these figures. For instance, I was looking at the yakshas, and they look really quite happy. And the Buddha always looks so somber,
Yes.
So everybody else seems to be having a much better time than the Buddha. And Naman, it would be good if you could give us a sense, because it's there in the book, but obviously in the context of, a short time span of an hour, it's not possible to touch on everything. But it would be good to know about the afterlife of Phanigiri. What happened once it ceased to be a Buddhist site? Were, objects reused? Were spaces reused? And, so in other words, how was it received after that? And therefore, to actually think of just freezing it in terms of its it being an ancient Buddhist site, can one put a question mark just to that? But first, Parul, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Nayanjot. My you see, my first reaction to the Phanigiri fragments, the Phanigiri Torana fragments, was a sense of completely, my heart went thud. Okay, and then why did that happen? Because I had this massive tome on Toranas, and this arguably the most beautiful of them was missing from that book.
Like that.
and so it became like a mission for me to run after every little piece of information on it, that all said and done, even as a sequel to the book, it has to belong to me. Then he said there was a degree of there was a lot of yearning and passion in the way that I had to pursue it, and it really altered our perception about the kind of gateways attached to early Buddhist architecture, or to any, pre-medieval Toranas found in the entire region of the Deccan and South India. All the while that I looked for them, I found a lot of them carved in relief sculpture. I found a lot of inscriptions, not a lot, but at least a few, say for example one in Ghanteshala, mentioning the presence of Toranas. Now, in relief sculpture of this period, they looked a lot like Sanchi and Barut. And I couldn't for the life of me figure out why we don't have actual standing examples of Toranas in the Deccan and South India, if so many of them are carved in relief sculpture. There was this very easy explanation that, there must be the tradition of making them in wood in southern India. Phanigiri has altered that perception completely, but post-Phanigiri, I have also realized that Phanigiri was not the only one, that you have some evidence of it from Chebrolu in the Brahminical context, and Gunturu in the museum you have a terminal piece. And so it appears that the connections with the Sachi Barut order, as I have called the Sachi Barut order of the gateways, was much better known that we had hitherto imagined and understood about them. So this seems to have been a pan-Indic language for the gateway up to a certain point, or at least up to the time that is usually identified with the Prakrit Buddhist cosmopolis.
I'll take a little bit of the first question as well, actually, because I think the sculptures were very often painted, and that communicated their mood in terms of facial expressions. And stucco sculptures and clay sculptures certainly were, but I think even stone sculpture. And that would have quite read. And I think a lot of the idea of the mood about who's having a good time and who's not is also communicated because of the language of posture, not just because of the facial expressions. I think in the Toran that Parul was showing, the most, I kicked myself while I was looking at the slides, because I felt that moment where Siddhartha is in the palace and Yashoda is turning her back to him, rejected, her rejection, that she cannot ensnare as a wife and entrap him to live on, as you were explaining Shododhan's desire to be able to maintain him within the palace. In that scene, the way her body language is so evocative and communicative of the poignancy of that scene. I think there is a whole language of mood that is communicated not just through facial expression, but there are two things that we also have to keep in mind, which is the language of posture or gesture, and the language of color, of pigment, which is something which we are denied now, which we can't see. On the historical question, on the serious question about what happened to Phanigiri after the 4th, 5th centuries, and when did it fall to rack and ruin, and what could have really happened, we are really quite clueless how the looting and the desecration of the site happened. Was it because of natural causes, and was it a massive earthquake that rendered these things unstable? Was it a perilous moment? Because the sculptures were artificially lifted and transported in antiquity and placed in this area, in this courtyard, between the Mahastupa and those and the Vihara. In between that, in that space, is where all the sculptures were gathered and placed there. And the way they were piled up and placed means that somebody had shifted them in antiquity itself. So there is something to talk about. Now, at the base of the hill, there are the remains of a little in the village, there's a Kakatiya temple. And there are some bits of spolia where you can see bits of the limestone from the Phanigiri being used in the monuments, other monuments and other buildings in the area. So there is some migration of objects and reuse. And the shape of the temple that comes up at the foot of the hill, that temple is quite special. It has a grand rath, but it has, most importantly, the Garbhagriha and the temple is actually located over the water reservoir. It's directly controlling the water supply, which it is guarding and protecting. And it's very interestingly made so as to have the water catchment carry on, and the reserve water would always be there at the temple, protected underneath the temple. So the true subterranean wealth of the temple is the water. And I think that's a kind of a history that links up with a longer history of the site in some way. So there is a rich Brahmanical history at the site as well. And indeed, that would have to be talked about in the afterlife of this building, and hopefully with the creation of a site museum or something like that over there.
So Nayanjot, with your permission, I'll add one more point to it. So the other thing, Naman and Nayanjot both, that we need to think about is the am I audible? Yeah. So is the, that there have been many moments of intervention at the site. So there is, of course, the Vishnu Kundan period and the Kakatiya period, and that the whole issue of spolia being used of Buddhist structures into Hindu structures. But at the same time, when you read for Phanigiri, we don't have those kind of reports. But when you look at the kind of reports from not very far away sites like Ghantashala, there is such a clear mention of cart loads of carved sculptures in the modern period, in the early modern period and the modern period, being taken as construction material. And so how much of Phanigiri we lost in the modern period is also not known. My sense is that if it had been used as spolia in, say, for example, the Kakatiya temple would have had more of it, or we would have a little more surviving. The way that mass, unlike, even though Kanaganahalli is in such ruins, there is so much more there than a site like Phanigiri has yielded. And it appears to me that a lot of its fate may have been akin to what we read about in Ghantashala in the modern period.
But since you mentioned, you mentioned Kanganhalli, just the point that the Ashokan, the edicts of the Ashokan stone there form the base for the image of Chandralamba in the temple.
Yes.
So, yes, please.
Nagarjunakonda whether you think the predominant school of Buddhism was the Madhyama Pratipada of Nagarjuna at that time.
Peter Skilling should be answering this question and not me. No, I don't think so. I think there seems to be a variety of different Buddhist sects that were active at this time, and the period that the site occupies is at least about 250 years, 200 years that the site seems to be active. So it seems that it served different monks of different orders. There has not been a consensus that has emerged on which one sect could have been the dominant sect at this site. There seem to be contesting bits of evidence that show which we normally associate with one particular sect, but there's also something of another, and they're not all of the same date. So the hypothesis that has been put forward is that it changed its affiliation over time. But I don't think these sects were so clearly defined in the area, actually. That's the general view. I think the definition comes from elsewhere.
Yes.
So thank you for the wonderful talk, Parul ma'am and sir, obviously. My question is to you, sir. The way that you explained that the performative culture, counter influences the visual culture, does it also influences the inscriptional culture? As in, you were saying that Prakrit was going along hand in hand with the Sanskrit. So is it that we find that hint of spice of popular narrative going on in the inscriptional story? So how would you respond to that? Thank you, sir.
I think we need to think about it as poetry. And poetry is always to be said out loud, and it is performed. And so poetry has this capacity. And I think when an inscription is written out, meter and rhythm and rhyme are thought of. And they're not just dry objects, dry texts that we read in English translation, but when actually read, there is a cadence to these inscriptions. And this particular inscription, as I read out to you, was so rich with metaphors that it is actually a piece of poetry, really.
So, Dr. B.M. Pandya, who is the organizer of this series, has gestured to me that we are well over time. And I'm sure there are lots of other questions which the speakers would be happy to answer outside, as also autograph the books, which are lying out, just in case you pick them up. So
thank you,
thank
Nayanjot.
you very, very much for
you.
this absolutely fabulous set of lectures.
I want to thank very much. On behalf of Marg, I truly want to thank you, Nayanjot, for taking the time to be here, and especially to Dr. Pandya for having made it all possible through the series of talks that I held over here at the IIC on Indian archaeology. So thank you very much.
Big hand to you.